She had $4, 2 children asleep hungry, and a winter closing in like a fist. What she did not have was any good reason to open her door to the dying stranger in her yard. But she opened it anyway. Nobody in Coldwater Draw could tell you why a woman with nothing to spare would spend the last of it on a man she'd never met, a stranger who, when he finally woke, looked at her plain little cabin and her thin, watchful children and said not one word of thanks. They only knew what came after. They knew that a poor widow saved a rich man's life that October, and that the rich man walked back up his mountain and out of her life, and that everyone in the draw agreed she'd been a fool for it. They were wrong about the fool part. They were wrong about a great many things. Because that widow never knew, couldn't have known, standing there in the snow with a half-dead stranger's weight dragging on her arms, that the choice she made in the worst hour of her worst year would reach forward through time and take hold of her children's whole lives, that it would change what they became, that it would change everything. Stay with me. This one takes its time, the way the true ones do, and I promise you before it's done, you'll understand exactly why an old male writer like me has carried it in my chest for 30 years and never once set it down. The man was heavier than he had any right to be for a body so close to leaving the world. That's the first thing I remember, how heavy he was, and how the snow had already gone into his beard and frozen there, little white beads of it, so that when we hauled him across the yard his face rattled faintly, like a thing that used to be alive. Ada had his arms. I had his legs. The wind came off Mule Ridge sideways and mean, throwing the storm at us in flat gray sheets, and every few steps one of us would go down to a knee and have to find our footing again in a foot of new powder. Door, Ada said, just that. She wasn't a woman who used 2 words where one would carry the load. I kicked it open with my good boot, and we brought him in out of the killing cold and laid him down on the plank floor of the only room that cabin had, and the fire threw its light over him, and I got my first real look at the man we'd just decided to save. He was old, or looked it. 60, maybe more, gray gone to white. A good coat, though, that's what I noticed, being a man who's learned to read a stranger's whole life off the state of his coat. It was a fine, heavy coat, the kind that costs more than I made in a season carrying the government's mail, and it was ruined now, soaked through and stiffening, but the quality of it said plain enough that this was not some drifter the mountain had chewed up and spit down into the draw. This was a man of means. A man who had somewhere warm to be, and people who'd note his absence, and had wound up freezing to death in a widow's yard anyway. The mountain doesn't care what your coat costs. I'd learned that already. He was learning it now. He's not gone, Ada said, her hand flat on his chest. Not yet. I should tell you who I am before I tell you the rest, since I'll be the one carrying you through this, and you ought to know whose eyes you're borrowing. Name's Harlan Voss. Back then I rode the winter mail on the high loop, 2 sisters up through Coldwater Draw, over the breaks, and down the far side to the mining camps, and back once a fortnight, all through the cold months when the stage couldn't run. It's a job for a man with no family to worry after him and no better prospects, which described me to the last button. I had a bad knee from a horse that fell on me in '71 and a habit of talking to that knee like it was a person, and I kept a tally book, still do. I write down the weather and the mail count and any small thing that strikes me. 6 deer at the ford, ice on the North Creek. Widow Wren's boy has grown 2 inches. It's a foolish habit. My mother had it before me, God rest her, counting and nodding as if writing a thing down could keep it from slipping away. It can't. But I've never found a better way to argue with time, so I keep at it. The Wren place was a regular stop for me. Ada took in the occasional traveler for a few coins and a meal, which was how she and those 2 children kept body and soul together after her husband died, and the mail loop being what it was, I'd bed down in her lean-to 8 or 10 nights a winter and be glad of it. That's how I came to be there the night we're speaking of. I'd ridden in ahead of the storm, meaning to get a hot supper and push on at dawn, and instead the storm had caught us all, and instead of supper I was on my knees on her floor with my hands in a dying stranger's coat, working the buttons with fingers I couldn't feel. Ada had found him. That part I only got later in pieces. She'd gone out to bring the goat in before the weather turned and seen the shape of a horse standing spooked and riderless at the fence line, and then seen the darker shape crumpled below it in the sage, and she had not gone back inside for help or for me. She had gone to him. A woman alone, in a rising blizzard, gone straight to a stranger's body in the dark. When I think on the whole of this story, and I have thought on it more than any man should think on anything, I always come back to that. Before there was any way of knowing he was rich, before there was any way of knowing he'd live, before there was any reason on this earth to think it would come to anything but grief and expense, she went to him. That's the part the whole draw forgot to marvel at later. They were all so busy talking about the money. "Sila's," Ada said, not loud, and the boy was there already, 11 years old and thin as a fence rail, standing at the edge of the firelight in his nightshirt with his little sister half behind him, both of them staring at the frozen man on their floor with the enormous solemn eyes of children who have already seen death once in that house and know what it looks like coming. "Yes, get the good blanket." There was a small silence then. I felt it more than saw it, because I knew, the way you come to know a household when you've bedded down in it a dozen times, that the good blanket meant the one blanket in that cabin that wasn't worn to gauze, the wedding blanket. The one thing of Michael Wren's that Ada had kept back from the dead men when they came. The one warm thing those two children had between them and the winter. And she was giving it to a stranger. Silas knew it too. He looked at his mother. Not to argue, that boy never argued with her, not once in all the years I watched him grow, but just to be sure. Just to give her the chance to change her mind. She didn't change her mind. "Go on," she said. "He went and got it. Now I have to tell you about the money, because the money is the reason anyone remembers this at all. And I've got to lay it out honest, even though the money is the smallest part of the truth. We didn't know that first night. I want that understood. Nobody in that cabin, working over that man's body through the small hours, had the first notion who he was. We knew the coat was fine. We knew his hands when I chafed them to bring the blood back, were a working man's hands gone soft, old scars on the knuckles, but soft now. The hands of a man who'd once labored hard and then paid others to labor for him a long while since. We knew he wore a wedding band worn thin, and a watch on a chain that Ada took off him and set on the shelf, careful in plain sight, so no one could ever say a thing about it later. That's the kind of woman she was. Half-frozen stranger dropped into her poverty like a gift from Providence, gold watch on his chest, and her first act was to put it up on the shelf where her own children could see it and know it wasn't theirs. The man's name, we'd learn, was Cornelius Vane, and Cornelius Vane owned, at that time, the better part of the Argenta silver claims up in the high country over the breaks, which is to say he owned more money than every soul in Coldwater Draw would earn between them from the day of their births to the day of their deaths. He'd gone up to inspect a new cut personally, being a man who trusted no one, and his fool guide had turned back at the first hard weather, and Vane, too proud and too stubborn to turn back with him, had pushed on alone and gotten himself lost and thrown and very nearly dead. But we didn't know any of that. Not that night. That night he was just a big, cold, ruined old man on a poor woman's floor, and we did what you do. We got the wet coat off him and the good blanket on him. Ada set water to boil and made a broth from almost nothing. I saw her put the last of the coffee in a rag and steep it and get a few spoonfuls of the warm, bitter stuff into him, coffee being the only stimulant that house owned, and it was near the last of it. And she used it on him without a flicker. She packed snow-warmed stones from the hearth all around him. She sent the children back to their pallet and told them to sleep, and neither of them slept. I could see the whites of their eyes in the dark all night, watching. And she sat up with him. All that long night, while the storm screamed down off the ridge and rattled the shakes and drove the fine snow in under the door in little drifts, we had to keep sweeping back. Ada Wren sat on the floor beside a stranger and kept him alive with her own body heat, and the last of her firewood, and the last of her coffee, and the only good blanket her dead husband had ever owned. Along about the blackest part of the night the man surfaced, not to sense he was far past sense but to sound. He began to talk, fever talk, the words all coming loose and floating. He said a name over and over. A woman's name, Eleanor, it was, though it came out broken. He wept some. A grown man of 60 weeping in his fever like a child, saying that name, and Ada leaned down close to his ear and I heard her, and what she said has stayed with me the whole of my life. She said, "I've got you. You're not alone, I've got you." She didn't know his name. She didn't know he was worth a fortune. She had no earthly reason to think this stranger would ever be anything to her but a hole in her thin resources, and most likely, a corpse to bury come morning at the cost of a coffin she couldn't afford. And in the dark she leaned down and told him he wasn't alone. I put my hand over my eyes. I'm not ashamed to say it. Bad knee and all, hard old male writer and all. I sat in the corner of that cabin and put my hand over my eyes so the children wouldn't see me. Because I have ridden a great many lonely miles in this world, and I have wished, more times than I could tally, that there were somebody in it who'd lean down and tell me that he didn't die. Morning came gray and still, the storm blown out, the whole world buried and shining and silent the way it gets after, and Cornelius Vane was still breathing. Worse, though the fever had him now, deep in the lungs, and I've buried men who fought that fever and lost, and I looked at Ada across his body in the thin dawn light, and I said the thing that had to be said. Ada, he may not be worth it. She knew what I meant. Doctoring a lung fever meant days, meant firewood we'd have to cut, and food out of a larder that didn't have days in it to give, and medicine from Dobbs' store and 2 sisters that cost money she flatly did not have. I'd counted her coins myself once, helping her figure the debt, and I knew to the penny it was $4 and some odd cents, and that $4 was meant to carry 3 people through to spring. He might take everything you've got and die anyway, I said, and leave you worse off than you are. You know that. I know it, she said. Folks would understand, I said, if you just kept him warm and let it go however it goes. Nobody could fault you. You've got 2 children to see through the winter. That's your first duty and everybody knows it. She was quiet a while. She had that broth rag in her hands, wringing it out, and her knuckles were red and cracked from the cold and the work, and she looked at that dying man, and then she looked over at the pallet where her own 2 children lay pretending to sleep. And I watched a woman make the hardest kind of choice there is, the kind where doing right by a stranger might mean doing wrong by your own. Harlan, she said finally, when Michael died in that mine there were 11 men on the other side of that cave-in for 3 days, and I have gone over it in my mind every night since, whether in the dark before the air ran out there was somebody with him, whether some man reached over and took his hand and told him he wasn't alone. Her voice didn't break. She wouldn't let it. I'll never know, but I'll tell you what I decided. I decided that as long as I've got a hand to reach out with, no dying man is going to lie on my floor and think there's nobody in the world that cares whether he lives or dies, rich or poor, worth it or not. That's not a thing I get to weigh. She wrung the rag out one more time. So no, I'm not letting it go however it goes. I never argued with her again. Not that day, not ever. I stayed on, told myself the trail was too fresh with snow to ride, which was half true, and stayed and cut her wood and rode to 2 sisters when the drifts allowed and stood at Dobbs' counter, while she spent one of her $4 on a physic for the man's lungs, a whole dollar, a quarter of everything she owned on a stranger, and Dobb raised an eyebrow at me, and I told him to keep his eyebrow to himself. The children took to it in the way children will. Little Josie, who was 8, decided the sick man was hers to nurse and appointed herself to it, laying cool cloths on his forehead with a seriousness that would have made you weep, talking to him low the way her mother did. Silas was more guarded. Silas was a boy who'd learned already that the world takes things, and he watched this stranger consume his family's small store of warmth and food with a wariness that wasn't unkind but wasn't soft either. He did the man's share of chores without being asked. He gave up his place by the fire, but he watched. And once, when he thought no one saw, I caught him standing over the sleeping man's face, just looking, with an expression I couldn't read and never forgot. For 3 days Vane hung between. On the fourth the fever broke. He came back to himself slow, like a man surfacing from deep water. And I was there for it. I was sitting near the fire mending harness. I was there when Cornelius Vane opened his eyes in that cabin and looked around at the bare plank walls, the one cracked window stuffed with rag against the cold, the threadbare pallets, the thin barefoot children, the worn-down tired-eyed woman who had spent 4 days and a quarter of her fortune keeping him in the world. And here is where I have to tell you the hard part, because I promised you honest and I'll give you honest. He was not grateful. He looked around that cabin, and something crossed his face that I've had 30 years to name, and the closest I can come is contempt. Not for Ada, for the poverty of it, for the smallness. Here was a man who'd been dragged back from death by the poorest hands in the county, and his first clear thought, plain on his face, was disgust at the poorness of the place he'd been dragged back to. "Where's my horse?" he said. That was the first thing out of him, not thank you, not who are you, where's my horse? "Stabled and fed," Ada said even. "You've been very ill." "How long?" "4 days." He tried to sit up and couldn't, and the failure of his own body seemed to anger him worse than anything, and he lay back and stared at the ceiling and said, in a voice like a man used to being obeyed, "I'll need to send word to my people. There'll be men looking for me. Do you have anyone who can ride to the Argenta camp?" And that was the moment. That was the moment the word Argenta dropped into that cabin, and I watched it land, and I understood who was lying under the wedding blanket. The Argenta claims. Vane, Cornelius Vane, the Silver King of the Breaks. The richest man in 100 miles was flat on his back on Ada Wren's floor, and he'd woken up cross about it. Ada didn't so much as blink at the name. If she understood what it meant, and she must have, everyone knew the name Vane. She gave no sign. She just said, "Harlan can carry word when the trail clears. Rest now. Your lungs aren't sound yet." "I don't require nursing," he said. "You required it 4 days running," she said. "And you'll require it a while yet, so you may as well be pleasant about it." And she went back to her cooking, and I will tell you I nearly laughed out loud, and I saw Silas by the woodbox bite down on a smile. Vane looked at her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, I don't imagine, not in a very long time. Money builds a wall around a man, and everyone on the far side of the wall speaks to him careful. Ada Wren spoke to him like he was just a difficult old man in her way, which is exactly what he was, and I think it confused him down to his boots. He didn't thank her, not that day. He turned his face to the wall and slept, cross and rich and rescued, and outside the light was going, and I noted in my tally book, "Storm blown out. Man will live. God knows why. 4 deer at the ford gaunt." I want to leave you here at the end of this first part, with the thing I couldn't have known then and know too well now. That cross, ungrateful, hard old man was going to change those 2 children's lives. He was going to reach into that cabin and lift Silas and Josie Wren up into a whole different future than the one poverty had marked out for them. It's true, every word of it, and it's the reason I'm telling you this at all. But it did not happen the way you think. It did not happen because a rich man was moved by a poor woman's kindness and opened his purse. I've heard it told that way over the years, and every time I hear it I want to take the teller by the collar. Because the truth of how it happened is stranger and sadder and finer than that, and it cost more than money, and before it was through it would ask something terrible of that widow, one more choice, harder than all the rest. I'll tell you the whole of it, stay with me. The men from Argenta came for him 9 days later, and Cornelius Vane left Coldwater draw the way he'd come into it, without a thank you. I need you to sit with how that felt in that cabin because I sat with it and it near broke my heart. 2 weeks Ada Wren had kept that man alive. 2 weeks of her food, her fire, her medicine, her sleep. Josie had cooled his fever with her own small hands. Silas had chopped an extra cord of wood a boy his size had no business chopping to keep the sick man warm. And when Vane's men rode down out of the breaks with a fine horse and a fur robe and a flask of good brandy for their master, Vane let them bundle him up and set him on the horse, and he looked down at the family standing in the snow, and he took out a money clip. He peeled off some bills. I didn't count them. I didn't have to. I could see it was a great deal, more cash money than that family had held in years, and he leaned down and pressed it into Ada's hand. "For your trouble," he said. And Ada Wren, poor as dirt, $4 minus the dollar she'd spent on his physic, 2 children to feed, winter half gone and half to come. Ada Wren folded the bills back into his hand and closed his fingers over them and stepped back. "It wasn't trouble," she said. "It was Christian duty. You don't pay for that. Go on home, Mr. Vane, get well." I have replayed his face in that moment 10,000 times, because a thing happened in it. A crack. He'd offered her money because money was the only language his heart had left, the only way he knew to make an account balance. "You took something from me, I pay you, we're square, and I owe you nothing, and I need feel nothing." That's the deal a rich man makes with the world to keep the world at arm's length. And she wouldn't take the deal. She handed it back. She left the account open. She left him owing her something that couldn't be paid in silver, and I watched it land on him like a blow, and he had no idea what to do with it. He rode away without another word. The children watched him go. Josie cried a little. She'd nursed him. He was hers, and now he was gone. Silas didn't cry. Silas watched that fine horse and that fur robe and that flask of brandy go up the trail toward a world of warmth and plenty he would never in his life get to enter, and then he looked down at his own bare feet in the snow, and then he went inside and chopped wood until dark, and I let him. And that, everyone in the draw agreed, was that. The widow had thrown away a fortune out of pride, folks said, handed back money that would have fed her children for a year, out of some stiff-necked notion of charity. Fool woman. I heard it said at Dobbs' counter more than once, and I threw a man out of my path over it once, bad knee and all. They were sure it was the end of the story. It was barely the middle. 3 weeks after Vane rode off, a wagon came down into Coldwater Draw. Not Vane. A younger man, well-dressed, careful. I later learned he was Vane's man of business. A fellow named Prentice who handled the Silver King's affairs and, I gathered, had been handling a great deal more than affairs lately. He came into Ada's yard and got down and took off his hat, which was more courtesy than his master had shown in 2 weeks, and he asked to speak with Mrs. Wren. I was there. Mail Loop had me back through, and I'll confess I timed it. I wanted to see how this came out. Prentice stood in that cabin, turning his hat in his hands, and he told Ada that Mr. Vane had died. The lung fever had come back on him, up in his fine warm house on the mountain, worse the second time, and this time there had been no one to sit up with him through the black hours. His people were paid to keep the fires and cook the meals and mind the accounts, but not one of them, it seemed, had thought to sit on the floor by his bed and hold his hand and tell him he wasn't alone. He died the way rich men often do, Prentice said, and there was something raw under his careful words when he said it, surrounded by everything and no one. Ada sat down slow. Josie began to cry. Silas went very still. And Prentice took out papers. Vane had changed his will. In the last weeks of his life, the sick, strange, contrary old man had sent for Prentice and changed his will, and the change was this. A sum of money, not his whole fortune. He had grandnephews back east who got the bulk of it and the claims besides, but a sum, held in trust, for the education and establishment of the 2 Wren children, Silas and Josie, by name. Not for Ada. That was the thing. He'd known better than to leave it to Ada, because he'd learned in 2 weeks on her floor that she'd hand it back. He'd left it to the children in trust, where she couldn't refuse it on their behalf without robbing them of a future. And he'd known that too. He'd known she'd sacrifice anything of her own, but she would not sacrifice her children's one chance. He'd found the one gift she couldn't give back. Cross, contrary, hard old man. And in the last clear act of his life, he'd reached down into that poverty, with the only kind of understanding he had left, and made sure those two children would never be as poor as their mother had been. There were conditions. The trust would school them, real schooling, back in a proper town, boarding at first, and then whatever their aptitudes carried them to. It would set each of them up when they came of age, Sela's in a trade or a profession, Josie with a portion of her own that no husband could touch, which was a radical and thoughtful thing for a man of that day to have specified. And I've always wondered what he saw in that fierce little girl who nursed him that made him think of it. But the conditions meant the children would have to go. Away. To the town, to the school, to the world on the far side of the wall. And Ada Wren, who had lost her husband and buried a baby before that, I learned later, and whose entire remaining wealth in this world was those two children asleep on a pallet by her fire, Ada Wren was being asked to let them go. That was the last choice. That was the terrible one I promised you. I watched her hold that choice in her hands for the better part of an hour, and I'll not pretend I know all of what passed through her, but I saw the shape of it on her face. Because you understand, the money didn't take her poverty away. She'd handed her own portion back. This was the children's in trust, and if the children went off to school and grew into the wide world, Ada would be left exactly where she was, a poor widow alone in a cold cabin in Coldwater Draw, only now without the two small warm bodies that were the entire reason she got up in the mornings. The gift that lifted her children up was the same gift that would empty her house and her arms. She could refuse. She could find some way to keep them, plead the conditions, keep them home, keep them close, keep them poor and cold and hers. No one would blame a widow for wanting her children by her. It would even look like love. That's the part that snags in my throat all these years later, that keeping them would have looked like love, and half the mothers in the draw would have done it and called it love. Josie, 8 years old, was watching her mother's face and had already understood more than a child should. "Do we have to go, Mama?" she said, very small. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with you." And Sela's 11, but old. That boy was always old. Sela said nothing at all. But I saw him look at those papers on the table at the word school, and I saw a thing in his face that I'd seen once before. The day Vane rode off toward the world of warmth and plenty on his fine horse while Sela stood barefoot in the snow. Hunger. Not for food. For the far side of the wall. For a life bigger than the one poverty had measured out for him. He wanted to go so badly it frightened him, and he wanted it so badly that he was ashamed of wanting it, because wanting it meant leaving his mother alone, and he loved his mother more than his own breath. So the boy did the same thing his mother had done to him that first night over the good blanket. He looked at her. He didn't argue for it, and he didn't argue against it. He just looked at her and gave her the chance to decide. Ada Wren looked back at her son, and then at her daughter, and then, for a long moment, at the fire, at the cold cabin, at the whole cramped frozen shape of the life that was all she'd ever be able to give them if she kept them. "You'll go," she said. Josie started to cry harder, and Ada gathered her in and held her and said it again, steady, into her hair. "You'll go, both of you. You'll go and you'll learn to read every book there is, and you'll grow up warm, and you'll become," and here her voice did break finally, the only time I ever saw it break clean through, "you'll become everything I can't make you here. And I will think about you being warm, and I'll be so proud I can hardly stand it. That's not losing you. Do you hear me? A mother who lets her children get big and go, that's not losing them. That's the whole job. That's the whole job done right." I had to go stand outside. I couldn't be in the room. I stood in her yard in the cold with my hand over my eyes for the second time in this story, and I want you to know it was the same yard where she'd found a dying stranger in the sage and gone straight to him. And I stood there, and I understood that I had watched the same woman make the same choice twice, to give away the thing she could least afford to give, because someone else needed it more than she needed to keep it. once for a stranger. Once for her own children, which was harder, because keeping them would have felt like love and giving them away felt like tearing out her own heart with her hands. She gave them away anyway, because she loved them more than she loved having them. That's the transformation, friend. That's the thing the title promises, and I'll finally hand it to you plain. Yes, Cornelius Vane transformed those children's lives. Yes, the money did it. Silas Wren went off to school, and I'll tell you he became a doctor, a lung doctor, of all the things in the world. A man who spent his life sitting up through the black hours with the fevered and the dying so that not one of them, rich or poor, worth it or not, would lie there thinking nobody in the world cared whether they lived. Josie became a teacher, and then something more than a teacher, a founder of schools, a fierce small woman with a portion of her own that no man could touch, exactly as a dying old man had thought to arrange for her. They rose. They rose so high out of that cabin that their own children would never believe there'd been a cabin at all. But it wasn't the rich man who transformed them. Not really. He only paid for it. The transformation, the true one, the one that made them into people who'd sit up with the dying and build schools for the poor, that came from their mother. And it was already in them before Vane's money ever arrived, because they had watched her, on the worst night of the worst year, get down on the floor beside a frozen stranger and give away her last good blanket and tell him he wasn't alone. Children become what they've watched. Silas doctored the dying because he'd watched his mother doctor the dying. Josie lifted the poor because she'd watched her mother, who had nothing, give it all away. The money bought them the schooling, but the shape of who they'd be inside that schooling, that was made in a cold cabin, for free, years before, by a poor woman who never once thought she was teaching them anything at all. Ada Wren lived on alone in that cabin for a good many years. I kept coming through on the mail as long as I rode it, and I'll tell you the children never forgot her. Letters every week, money she wouldn't spend, and once Silas was grown and settled he came for her, wanted to move her to a warm house in the town near his practice, and she went finally in her old age. But for a long stretch of years in the middle there she was alone in the draw, and folks still shook their heads over her sometimes. The widow who handed back a fortune, and then handed away her own children on top of it, and had nothing left to show for any of it but an empty cabin. I never could make them understand. I stopped trying. But I'll tell you what I saw. The last winter I rode the high loop before my knee gave out for good, and they put a younger man on the route. I stopped at her place like always, and she made me coffee, real coffee now. She could afford it, a small thing, but it undid me a little, and we sat by her fire, and on the shelf, where she'd once set a stranger's gold watch so her children could see it wasn't theirs, there was a photograph. Her son the doctor, her daughter with a schoolhouse full of children behind her, and beside the photograph, folded neat, worn now to almost nothing, thin as a whisper, the good blanket. She'd gotten it back. Somehow, after Vane died, it had come back to her among his things, and she'd kept it, and there it sat on the shelf beside the pictures of the 2 lives it had cost her everything to build. I asked her, I don't know why, 30 years I've wondered why I asked, whether she ever regretted it, any of it, the stranger, the fortune, the children, whether she'd have kept them home if she'd known how long the alone years would be. She looked at the fire a while. She was old by then and small, and her hands were still cracked from all the winters. She said, Harlan, that night I found him in the sage, I didn't have anything, $4 and 2 children and a winter coming. She reached over and touched the worn old blanket just with her fingertips, and I gave it all away over the years, every bit of it. The blanket first, and then the money I wouldn't take, and then the children last. She was quiet. The fire ticked. And I have thought some nights that a smarter woman would have held on tighter. I waited. She didn't finish. She never did finish. She just sat looking at the fire with her fingers on the blanket, and after a while she smiled a little at something I couldn't see and let the sentence go. I've spent 30 years finishing it for her, and I never can. Every ending I put on it is too neat. So I'll leave it where she left it, on her shelf beside the pictures, in the firelight, with her fingers on the thing she gave away and got back, and could never quite bring herself to say she was glad she'd